have the very special guest, Gwen Reiser here from the Hereditary Cancer Institute, UNC. So that is a genetic counselor that's licensed and is the foremost in the area, and we are so thrilled that she gave us the time tonight to spend with us and educate us. The format this evening will be that she will educate us, and she's got a wonderful presentation, and then the second half of this conference will be a Q&A. So we will open it up just like Julie did, and Julie asked a question and she said she could hear. Some people may be struggling with their phones, and I would suspect that that's due to your phone software. You may have an app that is required if you are on an iPhone or you are on an Android. You may need to download the Zoom app in order to hear the audio. So try that, Melinda, if you can. We are trying to record this, so hopefully this will be available after the session today. So welcome, Gwen. I'm so glad to have you. So can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Sure. So I'm born and bred right here in Nebraska. I have worked at the University of Nebraska Medical Center for almost 30 years, and most of that time has been spent working in the hereditary cancer clinic. So I'm excited to be here tonight. Thank you for inviting me. And I hope to give you lots of information about breast cancer and some of the genes that we know about. So
great. And also we have with us 20 very special guests. You can't see them right now, but we have 20 survivors live with us tonight. So they will be, they are very attentive, and we're thrilled to have them here with us. So we do have a little bit of a live audience for those of you that are out there in the web world. So we're going to do you want to just get started right with the PowerPoint? We've got something I'm going to share here, and we will get this going.
Yeah, so I think sometimes it's some of the concepts when we start talking about genetics and testing, it's easier sometimes to see pictures and talk about those. And okay. Okay.
Okay. There we go.
There we go. All right. So hopefully everyone can see what part of my presentation here, and I don't think I can move it. Yeah. So what do I need to?
Well, we're having. Hold on.
All right.
Hold on just a second. Let's just do this. This technology.
And I'm glad I have someone here to help me because this is all new to me.
Okay. So let's try this. And now see if that doesn't work.
There we go. All right. So I thought we'd just back up a little bit and talk a little bit about just basic cancer statistics. So, you know, a lot of what I do as part of my job is I ask people about their family history of cancer. Who in your family has cancer? And if you look at the statistics, you know, 1 in 3 women will develop some type of cancer in their lifetime. For men, the number is even higher. 1 in 2 men will develop cancer. And so if you think about those numbers and you think about families and how big families can get sometimes, it's very rare that there is no family history of cancer when we ask about that. So it's common to see cancer in families, and that's part of why we ask the questions. And how common is breast cancer? Well, if you look at just breast cancer specifically, it's one of the most common cancers that we see in women. About 15.3% of all cancers are breast cancer. And so when you look at family histories and ask about that, it's not uncommon to hear about someone in the family who has breast cancer. And I know many of the people in this room and probably many people in the audience have been personally affected by breast cancer, or know someone in their family, or know someone that they work with that has a history of breast cancer. So it's something that we see very often, and lots of questions are asked about, is this something that's hereditary or not? So when you start to talk about, is cancer genetic? Well, you know, basically all cancer is genetic. And what I mean by that is that we're talking about changes that occur within the genes in our cells. So this is a little picture that just kind of looks at a cell, and if we could look inside that cell, we would see these little tiny structures called chromosomes. They look like little X's, and you can see them under the microscope, actually. Those are packages of genes. We can't see those genes under the microscope. We have to use more specialized technology in laboratories to be able to analyze the genes. But scientists think we have something like 20,000 genes in every cell in our body. Each of those genes has a very special role or function. I like to think of genes as recipes that tell us how to make a person. So we have some genes that tell us how tall we should grow or what color eyes or hair should be. There are some genes that are very important right away at birth, can cause problems in childhood if they're not working properly. But more and more often now, we're starting to find these genes we know that can affect our health later in life. So genes for things like heart disease, diabetes, cancer that we're looking at. And what we're looking for are the tiny structures that make up those genes, the DNA. And that's kind of the basic aspect of what genetics is. We look at the DNA, and that DNA is very lined up in a very specific way or order or sequence, and it's that sequence of the DNA that tells that gene what it should do in the body, right? So all cancer is genetic, in that some of those changes that happen in that DNA start to go awry in cells that are cancer cells. And this is kind of looking at the difference between sporadic cancer, the kind that just occurs out of the blue. Most of us, well, we all know that each of us have 2 copies of every single gene. So of those 20,000, just double that, because we have 2 of each. Most of the time, when we talk about cancer genes, we're talking about genes that are involved in controlling cell growth, or maybe helping to repair DNA that gets damaged, or somehow protecting against cancer from occurring. So if we all have 2 copies of every gene, one we get from our mom's side of the family, the other comes from our dad's side. Those genes that are working just fine help cancer. Exposed to in the environment. We think of these as, sometimes we call these somatic mutations. Just means that they occur within the genes, and they're acquired. And if that happens once, that's okay, because we have 2 of these genes that are protective, right? And so we still have one gene that's working just fine, helping to protect against cancer. But now let's say we live another 20, 30 years, we come into contact with something else that damages our other gene that we have that's supposed to be protective. Now we have nothing left within that cell to prevent it from becoming a tumor or cancer. And that's what's shown on the top of this slide here in the case of sporadic cancer, and why those cancers tend to occur later in life. You know, the longer we live, the more things we're exposed to, the more likely it is for cancer to occur. Some people even believe that if we all live long enough, eventually all of us would develop some type of tumor or cancer because of that process. In some families, though, instead of starting out with 2 of those genes that are working just fine, a person is born with 1 gene that's working and 1 that's not. So these are our hereditary families. So we have 1 gene that's not working that we've already inherited, and so that person does not have cancer, but it's kind of like being 1 step closer to the development of cancer. And so these are what we consider our germline mutations. You might hear that term referred to sometimes, where a person has 1 inherited and 1 acquired mutation in order for cancer to occur. So in those cases, that's where we see cancer occurring at younger ages and more often than we would expect just by chance. So all cancer is genetic. Let me just go back a little bit here. So a lot of work right now is actually looking at the genetic makeup of the cancer cells themselves. We know that all breast cancer is not the same. They don't all respond in the same way, and we think that probably has to do with the genetic makeup of the cancer itself. A lot of work is being done in that area. Sometimes it calls tumor genomics, looking at that. And that's, the work is really looking at targeted therapies and making that more of a personalized treatment plan then for someone who has a breast cancer. I'm not going to talk tonight about the somatic mutations or those tumor genomic tests that are available. That's more for an oncologist to go into depth for. I'm going to talk more and focus more on just the hereditary cancer and some of those genes that we know about that can be inherited. So all cancer is genetic. However, not all cancer is hereditary. So there's a difference there. Genetic just means that it's changes that occur within the genes. Hereditary means it's a gene that we have inherited, that we were born with, that we can pass on to the next generation. So how often is cancer hereditary? Well, the good news is that most of the time it's not. And this is just a little pie diagram that shows that, maybe somewhere between 70 and 80% of all cancers are just thought to be sporadic, the kind that occurs out of the blue, maybe due to environmental factors that mostly play a role. There are some families where we'll see maybe more than one person who develops a cancer, and there might be some familial causes for that. Maybe they have some common environmental factors or lifestyle or diet things in common that maybe contribute to their cancer risk, but we don't really think of them as something that's hereditary. We're really only talking about somewhere between 5 and 10%. So just a small wedge of that pie there is due to cancers that can be inherited. And so, well, let's just focus on that small wedge of the pie then. How much of that is, what do we know about the genes that make up that wedge of the pie? Well, a lot of women that I talk to have heard about 2 genes in particular, BRCA1 and BRCA2. Thanks to Angelina Jolie, who came out and talked about her family 3 or 4 years ago. A lot of people have heard about these 2 genes. They are 2 genes that were discovered more than 20 years ago, so we know quite a bit of information about them. And up until really just a couple of 2 or 3 years ago, those were the only 2 genes that we tested for. And we think that they are responsible for the majority of families that have inherited breast cancer. So they are the big players in, when we look at causes of hereditary breast cancer. But in the last few years, we've also identified some additional genes that play a role. And we'll talk about some of those here in a little bit, but somewhere between, maybe up to 30% of that portion is due to some of these other genes that have also been described. But we know that there are families out there that have hereditary breast cancer. It's obvious that it's a gene in the family just by how many people in the family have cancer. And we still have not identified what that cause is. And so there's still kind of this unknown for many families that we see that we're still trying to sort that out for. So most of these genes are inherited in what we call a dominant fashion. And what that means is that if you've got one of these genes that's not working, and here we have a parent 2 has 2 genes that are working fine. That's the only thing that they can pass on to their children. But parent 1 there has 1 gene that's working and 1 that's a non-functioning gene that has a variant or a mutation in it. And so when we have children, we pass on 1 gene or the other, not both. There's a 50-50 chance of that. Pure chance. None of us get to choose which genes we get or which ones we pass on. It's just kind of like flipping a coin. So in a dominant gene, anybody who carries a gene, there's a 50% chance that they can pass it on to their children. And of course, that tells us a little bit then about the risk for their siblings, and we know that it probably had to come from one parent or the other of theirs. So by knowing that, it helps us target who in the family we should test next once we've identified what one of those genes is. Oops. So not everyone who inherits the gene develops cancer. We have kind of a fancy term for that in genetics. We call that incomplete penetrance. And so a person can live to be, 100 years old, have one of these susceptibility genes that they carry, and never get cancer. And we wish we understood that a little bit better. It may be that there are other protective genes that they carry. Maybe there are environmental factors playing a role there. We really just don't have a complete understanding of that. And so it makes it confusing sometimes when we look at families, because someone may not have a cancer, but they can carry the gene, pass it on then to a child who develops a cancer. And it appears to maybe be skipping generations or something in families. The gene's not skipping generations. It's there. It's being inherited one generation after the next. But the expression of that can sometimes be a little bit variable. And then keep in mind that sporadic cancers can occur even within hereditary cancer families. So sometimes it's hard to sort out what was something that would have just happened anyway and what was the result of a cancer that, or a cancer gene that we knew about. So I'm here to tell you a little bit about, why family history is important and why it's important to look at that and think about that. It's one of the first questions we ask about when someone comes in to see us to talk about testing. Sometimes people ask me, well, why can't I just have my blood drawn and why can't we just send it to the lab and why can't I just get it tested? Well, the family history really does answer some important questions for us before we go down that path. And this is an example of a family history. And you can see there's an arrow there pointing to a circle down at the bottom. Circles are represented by women in the family. Men are represented by squares. You can see we've got a person here. She's connected with a line to her sister. If you go back a generation or up, in this case, there's a square there. That's her father. And he's connected to a sister and grandparents at the top. And we try to at least look at 3 generations in order to be able to see any pattern that might be present. So this is how we look at families and genetics. And sometimes it's easier to see the big picture if we have the family history kind of drawn out in front of us looking at that. The cancer family history answers 3 or 4 very important questions. The first is cancer hereditary in my family? Do I even need to worry about this for my family? Do I need to do any kind of genetic testing? So we know that most cancer is sporadic, and so most of the time the answer is no, it's not hereditary for families. But 10% of cancer is hereditary, and so we look for those features that we'll talk about here in a little bit to help us sort out whether or not we should go any further with testing. The second question that gets asked is, well, what gene or genes should we be looking at? If we're going to be doing genetic testing, we want to make sure we're doing the right testing for that family. There's more than one gene out there for breast cancer, and so we want to make sure that the correct gene is being tested. Do we just need to look at a single gene? Do we need to look at a specific alteration that's already been reported in the family? Or should we be looking at these multi-gene panels, looking at several genes all at the same time? And the family history can help sort that out for us. The third question, and sometimes the most important one for families, is will my insurance cover the cost of testing? And we know that things like Medicare has very strict criteria of when testing will be covered based on what we're seeing in a family history. I am our University of Nebraska Medical Center is a member of NCCN, that stands for National Comprehensive Cancer Network, and we get together once a year to come up with specific criteria of when we believe that the testing would be indicated for families. So there's NCCN criteria, there's Medicare criteria. A lot of insurance companies will follow either one of those guidelines for when we should be doing testing. And then of course some individual insurance companies also have their own guidelines based on when they cover testing and when they don't. And a lot of it's based on what the family history is telling us. So if we have that information, we've got justification then, and we know kind of up front if that's testing that will be covered or not. And then once those test results come back, the family history is very important in helping to guide us in determining who we need to test next. What are those screening recommendations? Sometimes there are some research options available too, depending on what we're seeing in the family history. So that family history is very important. So it sometimes feels like a kind of a chore to collect some of that information and come up with that, but it's very important in analyzing and providing the best genetic testing for families. So these are some of the features that we look at or look for when we look at families. And all these things by themselves doesn't necessarily mean that it's hereditary, but it means we should take a closer look if we see any of these things and maybe consider genetic testing. So if we start to see cancer in more than 2 people in the family, and especially the same type of cancer, it kind of makes us wonder, Okay, is that something, is there a common cause for that? Could that be hereditary? Anytime we see a cancer under the age of 50, in the case of breast cancer, kind of the average age that we would expect to see that in the general population would be a woman in her mid-60s. In families that carry some of these hereditary genes, those cancers occur about 20 years younger, so average age mid-40s. So anytime a cancer occurs under 50, we want to take a closer look at that. It may not be uncommon to get one cancer, just because cancer is so common, but to get a second cancer, whether it's a bilateral cancer in the case of paired organs, or breast cancer and another cancer as a separate primary tumor, that would make us wonder, why is that happening? Is there a susceptibility there? And then there are certain things that we see when we look at the pathology of certain tumors. For example, for breast cancer, whenever we see what we call triple negative pathology, and that's estrogen receptor, progesterone receptor, and HER2 receptor status all negative, we call that triple negative. When we see that, we know that those tend to occur in younger women, and also have a little bit of a little higher incidence of being associated with some of the genes that we know about. So we use clues as to the tumor itself too in sorting that out. And then there are certain cancer clusters that we see in families. So for example, when we see breast cancer and ovarian cancer going together, we know there are certain genes that play a role in those cancers, or breast cancer and say pancreatic cancer. That makes us think of some additional genes. So certain cancer clusters we do watch for. And then anytime we see a rare type of cancer, so for example, a man who has breast cancer or certain childhood tumors, those things are more rare, and that makes us a little bit more suspicious of a hereditary process. And then there are some of those families where it just looks like a dominant gene, generation after generation. Some people come to me and they say, Gwen, everybody in my family has cancer. We can't ignore that. So even if it doesn't fit some of those other features, if it's a strongly a strong pattern, we definitely look at that. And I guess I would add one more thing to this, and this is a little bit new, but when we start looking at kind of the tumor genomics, sometimes we'll identify genes within the tumor cells that we know can be hereditary. So if we see some of those results come back, that's also another indication for moving forward with hereditary cancer gene testing. I think I might be frozen. Yeah, if you guys can advance me. Oh, there we go.
There we go.
Okay. So this is an example of a family history that would be fairly common that we would see in our hereditary cancer clinic. And you can see there's an arrow there pointing to a circle. And this individual has breast cancer. She was diagnosed at age 47, so a little bit young. Her family history, she has a sister that had both breast and ovarian cancer, kind of a striking pattern there. Another sister that had breast cancer at a young age. And this kind of points out, we need to look at both sides of the family when we think about these hereditary genes, because in this case, there's a father who had a prostate cancer, and his sister had breast cancer at a young age. So sometimes we think about, things like breast cancer being a female cancer, and we tend to focus on women in the family, but it's also important to think about men in the family too, and then kind of the male side of the family, dad's side of the family, because genes can be equally inherited from mom's side and dad's side. So I mentioned earlier two genes, BRCA1 and BRCA2, and there may be some people in the room that have heard about this, had testing for these two genes. Like I said, we've known about them for a number of years. So there's quite a bit of information about them. And but we have a lot of families that had testing done for these two genes and came back negative, and we kind of wondered, well, is there something more out there? So we know now that there are additional genes that play a role. This slide here kind of points out a couple of other things too that I wanted to mention. So there are certain populations that have common mutations or variants in those genes that We think that we call them founder mutations. They have probably been inherited for many, many generations. And one particular population that's been very well studied is the Ashkenazi Jewish population. And there are three specific alterations that those arrows are pointing to that we do see in that population. So if we know about that, sometimes we can do a shortcut and just look at those three alterations first before we do any further testing. On that first family history that we looked at, one of the questions we do ask about is family ancestry, because that's important. Knowing where someone came from gives us a clue about what genes they've inherited or what their ancestors might have had, and that can help guide us a little bit too with testing. So this is looking at lifetime risks for breast cancer. And if you look at that first little column there, that's the average risk that all women start out with. So none of us have a zero risk. Just being a woman is a risk factor for breast cancer. And that's that 12% lifetime risk that you hear quoted all the time. So we all start with that. In some families, there's a little bit of a familial risk that might increase that breast cancer risk a little bit. And again, those might be some genetic factors or environmental factors playing a role there. And then at the far end, where it says high-risk genes, those are the genes like BRCA1 and BRCA2, where we know those are major players. The risks associated with having those genes are quite high. Lifetime risk to develop a breast cancer if you carry one of those genes in some families may be as high as about 87%. So we want to make sure that we're following someone in a very different way. If you've got an 87% lifetime risk versus a 12% lifetime risk, that's a big difference. So there's some things that we can do to help manage that risk, some screening things that we would, management-wise, would offer, sometimes some preventative options too that we'll talk about here in a little bit. Some of the newer genes that we're looking at nowadays aren't maybe as high a risk as BRCA1 and 2. Can I consider them some of our moderate risk genes that we can look at? And those have an increased risk for lifetime risk for breast cancer associated with them, but not as high as what we see with BRCA1 and 2. Still higher than the general population risk. So knowing what that gene is in the family, we can kind of estimate what that lifetime risk is and base our management decisions on that. So here is a short list, I guess, of some of the genes that we know about today. And a lot of laboratories offer genetic testing. It used to be we just had one. Now we have several options available. And many of them are doing a panel of genes that look similar to this. There are about 8 or 9 different genes that play a role in hereditary breast cancer. You can see the two at the top there are BRCA1 and BRCA2. They have the highest risk, 85% lifetime risk. There are other cancers that we do sometimes see in those families as well. Ovarian cancer can go along with both of those genes. Prostate cancer in men, pancreatic cancer in men and women have also been reported. So when we see those cluster of cancers, it kind of makes us think about those two genes. And like I said before, up until about 3 or 4 years ago, those were the only 2 genes that we could look at. So if that came back negative, we just stopped there. Sometimes there were some research things that we could get families involved in, but for the most part, that was it. Since then, we've identified additional genes, and you can see kind of going down that list there. Some of those genes have funny names. They don't mean a whole lot to most of us, but you can see that each of those genes has a breast cancer risk that is higher than the general population, high enough that it changes what we recommend for medical management. So sometimes we call this our moderate to high risk breast cancer panel or our clinically actionable breast cancer panel, because if we find a variant or mutation in one of those genes, it does change what we would recommend for screening and management. Some of those genes also have other cancers associated with them. You can kind of see on that far column there some of the other cancers that we sometimes see. And so by knowing that, looking at family histories, that can sometimes help guide us into. So what are the implications of finding these genes? Well, if we look at the high-risk genes, like BRCA1 and 2, and there's a small handful of some other genes that we would consider a little bit of a higher risk, anywhere from about 45 to 87% is kind of what that category is. For most of those genes, we have well-established guidelines for cancer screening and prevention. So if we find a mutation with those genes, we know what to do with that information. There are a group of what we consider more the moderate risk genes, maybe somewhere between about 20 and 58% lifetime risk. And again, for many of those genes, we've identified families following them over time, and we do have some established guidelines for them as well. We also know that there are genes that play a role in hereditary breast cancer, but probably a much smaller role. Some of these are fairly new genes. We're just starting to describe them. We're just starting to identify families that have them, so there's not a whole lot of information yet. And screening and prevention guidelines may or may not be available for them yet. So sometimes we'll do some genetic testing, we'll identify a change in one of those genes, and we don't know exactly what to tell families conclusively about what that means for them. The screening may just be based on what we know about other families, or maybe about their own family history and what that's telling us. And then as far as management, in the far column, the average risk, so for all women, we tell them to be aware of their, be self-aware. If they notice any changes in their breast, any lumps, any discharge, go see their doctor about that. Don't wait, go get that checked out right away. We tell everybody to do that. And typically we recommend annual mammograms starting around age 40 for the general population, and once a year to go in and get a clinical breast exam. We don't usually recommend any kind of surgery or other risk-reducing recommendations there. But for our families that are in that high-risk category, there's some different things that we'd want to do for them. We don't want to wait till age 40 to start screening with mammograms. We want to start that a little bit younger. And in addition to mammograms, a lot of times we'll recommend a breast MRI, which is a more sensitive way to look at breast tissue, and alternate those every year. And then there are some risk-reducing options, like a risk-reducing mastectomy, and tamoxifen, which is an anti-estrogen medicine, can also be an option sometimes for those families. And same thing for our moderate risk families. Sometimes we don't start quite as young with our screening. It depends on the gene. And sometimes it depends upon what variant or mutation is within the gene too, and what the family history looks like. So all that can be talked about once a result comes back. And I wish I could tell you that all those results that come back are straightforward. It's either a positive or a negative result. It's a yes or no answer. But there are also some answers that aren't so clear-cut. And this is just kind of a, kind of a complicated slide. But basically what it tells us is that we know that there are variants that occur within genes all the time. Many of those are just benign changes. We don't even report those out. We would consider those a negative result. When we find changes within the gene that we know are significant enough that it probably does cause cancer, we consider those pathogenic. That's kind of the term that's used. Sometimes deleterious is a word that's used to describe those. So anything that's pathogenic or likely pathogenic, there's enough information about that particular mutation. We call that a positive result, and we talk about those implications of medical management based on that. But there's this little gray area sometimes where we'll find a variant and we're not completely sure what it means. Sometimes it is the first time it's ever been reported in a family. Sometimes there's just not enough information about it, and so we call those variants of unknown significance. And when that happens, we don't always have good screening guidelines to help guide us in what to do for those families, and we base that on what we know about the family. So again, that family history information is important. How often do we get those question marks? Well, it's not uncommon when we do genetic testing. Most of the time when people have testing done, they get a negative result, and that's represented by the blue here on your slide. And about 10% of the time, we'll get a positive result and use that information to test others in the family. But around 30% of the time, we'll get one of those variants of uncertain significance, and we just can't give families any more information about what that means at that point in time. Now, just because we don't know now doesn't mean we won't know 2 years from now, but at least that And at that time, there's not enough information. And I guess the one thing I'd want to point out to families too is that not all genetic testing is equal. There are a lot of labs out there that want to do genetic testing. Some of them are direct to consumer. They might look at a handful of genes, or they might use technologies that look at parts of the gene but not a complete gene test. And so it's important to kind of know what you're getting into, and that's what genetic testing can help sort out a little bit for families. So I have some slides here on benefits, risks, and limitations of genetic testing, but I think we want to open it up a little bit for some of the questions that we're having, and we can kind of cover that as we go along. So, okay.
Are they all in here? I have, well, they're not in here, but I have. Can we ask them?
Not yet. Well, yeah, in a minute. So,
Okay.
So, we have a question from Julie, and it says that she was initially diagnosed DCIS at 35 in 2009. Dr. Lynch completed the genetic testing. Then she was BRCA negative, was diagnosed again with a new cancer, 3B, in 2016. You mentioned earlier there are additional genetic testing available. Should I look into additional testing since I had it twice? Can one's BRCA genes change over time? And could I somehow now be BRCA positive?
Okay, great questions. So let's address the question, can your genes change? Well, they can change within cells, but what you're born with is what you're born with. So if you had a negative BRCA test back in 2009, if we tested for those same genes again, they would likely be negative. Now, there are some newer technologies that laboratories use, so sometimes we will identify mutations even within genes that we tested in the past. That's fairly rare, but we do sometimes see that. What I tell families is that if you qualified for genetic testing in the past and you had BRCA1, the BRCA testing is kind of the company's name for BRCA1 and BRCA2. If you had that testing and it was negative, and it was more than 3 or 4 years ago, we need to look again with some of the newer testing that's available. So yes, I would recommend coming back in and talking about what's available. And especially, you know, now that you have a second diagnosis, that's kind of another feature that we, you know, being a young age was one of the features that we look at for hereditary cancer, but having a second cancer might make us even a little bit more suspicious about that. So I would recommend, if you're interested in kind of finding out that information, yes, let's look again with the better technologies that we have and with the newer testing that we have. And by the way, for people who had testing done years ago, we've made a lot of improvements, not just in the number of tests that we can look at, but we used to, you know, for the cost to look at 2 genes that we used to do years ago, we can do a whole panel of genes for less than half that cost. So the cost is cheaper. Insurance is better about covering the cost of it nowadays, which in years past they wouldn't cover it all, and there were a lot of families that couldn't do the testing. And the turnaround time is quite a bit improved. For those of us that started working, you know, Dr. Lynch and those of us that have been doing this for a long time, I can remember when it used to take 3 months to get a result back. And that's a long time to wait for a result. Nowadays, we can do a big panel of genes and get those results back within a couple of weeks. So lots of improvements that.
Okay, I'm going to interrupt here. I'm hoping you can hear me okay. I'm getting some feedback from some that when I'm asking questions, you can't hear me, so I'm kind of being rude and going, no, I don't want to be on that side of the fence. One of the, I would just want to remind, if you have a question, use your Q&A function. And so we've got some here from our live audience, but if you've got one, please type it in and we'll answer it. But one of the questions that we got here was, when one gets tested, does it test for all of the different genes that you talked about tonight?
I would say it depends. It depends a little bit on your family history, and depends on you know, what panel of testing we think is appropriate to do. So most of the testing that we're doing today is is looking at a panel of genes. But like I said, I usually use the family history to help guide us how much we should be looking at. We're just focusing on breast cancer genes here tonight, but keep in mind that there are genes for other cancers as well. So we have genes we know that are implicated in hereditary colon cancer and hereditary kidney cancer. And so when I look at a family history and the question is about, you know, breast cancer, the person sitting in front of me has breast cancer, but we look at their family history and we see that, you know, there really are some features there that kind of fit with what we know about some of these hereditary colon cancer genes. Sometimes we'll do panels that include both the breast and the colon cancer genes, or breast, and there's some ovarian cancer genes that we might want to take a peek at too. So, and that's individualized based on the person and their family history a little bit.
That leads me to my next question. What if someone's not 100% positive on their family history and they don't have all the details?
Okay, good question. So there are a lot of reasons why we don't sometimes have the family history information that we want. Sometimes people are adopted, sometimes they don't know a lot about their dad's side of the family, or, you know, the key person in the family who had all that family history information has passed away, or we just don't have access to it. And, you know, I know that sometimes, you know, when I talk to families, if you go back too far in generations, people were very private about their history, and talking about things like cancer was just not something that people did. So sometimes we don't always have all that information that we need. We can do genetic testing on anybody. We don't tend to recommend that, but the question is, will insurance pay for it? And so if there are no, you know, if we don't have that family history, or that person doesn't have cancer themselves, and there really is no indication to do the testing, we typically don't recommend it. There are labs out there that are, you know, willing to take your money, and you know, if you're willing to pay for the testing, we'll do that. But so we sometimes have to work around that a little bit. You know, when we look at families, a lot of times, ideally, we like to start with someone first in the family who has had a cancer, because if we're going to find out information, it's more likely that we're going to find information. They're more likely to carry a gene, but sometimes that person is not available for testing, so we have to test someone else in the family, maybe someone who's unaffected. A lot of times I get the question of, well, I've already had cancer, not really interested in testing, can you just test my kids? But really, to know what to test your kids for, we need to start out with you, but that's not always available either. So there are always some exceptions, and some things that we can do to look more closely at that.
So if I have had breast cancer and I tested negative, should I test my daughter?
So if we have not identified a genetic change, and let's say we've done one of the current panels looking at all the genes that we should know about, we don't recommend testing. If that comes back negative, we don't recommend testing kind of that next generation, unless of course there's something on their dad's side of the family that we need to be aware of. But if you don't carry one of those genes that we can identify, we're not going to find it in your child, right? There could still be something hereditary, so we may still want to screen based on what we're seeing in the family history, but as far as genetic testing, not necessarily.
Great questions.
Yeah, really good questions.
Do you have any knowledge on the CHEK2 gene?
So CHEK2 is one of those kind of moderate risk genes that we know about. It's a gene that we've known about it for a while, but kind of our understanding of how that gene works and some of the families that have that gene, it's one of those genes that can be incredibly variable. There are some families that have the CHEK2 gene and all we see is maybe a little bit of breast cancer, a little later onset, not something that you would maybe typically think about when you think about hereditary breast cancer. And then there are some families that have this CHEK2 gene variant that have more than just breast cancer. There's colon cancer, there are lots of other cancers in the family, and it seems to be a little bit more penetrant. And what we're learning is that it's not just the gene, sometimes it's the variant or the mutation within the gene, and depending upon where that mutation is or what type of mutation it is, it affects the penetrance of that gene. It's not just the gene, but also what's changed about that gene that determines what we recommend for families for screening. So, and that's kind of a new area that we're getting into in genetics. It's not not all families that have CHEK2 gene mutations are the same.
I was tested negative for any cancer genes, but my father in my family has, or my father's side of the family has prostate in 2 different cases and breast cancer in 2 different cases across 3 generations. Should my sister or father be tested even though I was negative?
So I guess the question I would ask is, have you had cancer yourself?
Yes.
Yes, okay. So is it possible that your cancer was just a sporadic occurrence in the family, and that there is maybe a hereditary process in your father and that side of the family? Possibly. I would, to help, I guess, sort that out a little bit more for your family, it would be important to know, what the ages were of the people that had cancer, how aggressive their cancer was. One of the indications for prostate cancer testing is if someone has metastatic prostate cancer, which is a more aggressive, form of that, we would recommend some genetic testing there too. So the answer is maybe, possibly. I'd need to know a little bit more information about the family, but certainly worth looking into, yes.
So I have a question, Gwen, that someone asked. We see a lot, and actually a friend talked to me about this, that we are seeing more and more general practitioners or gynecologists, or these people that are just saying, hey, come in, I can draw your blood and do genetic testing, but in no way are they prepared. I mean, this person that talked to me about that was like, I didn't see that one coming. She thought she needed to be tested, but not at 20, and she was a little freaked out, or 22. And so can you talk about how important genetic counseling is in that whole process, and how that are, ready to hear the information? Should I be tested? If I am tested, what does it mean to hear the information? What's actionable? There's lots of stuff that goes on, and that's why it's so important to have people like you. So can you speak to that a little bit?
So a couple things is, so genetic testing is available. Families can do this. The question is, when's the right time to do testing? There may be some good reasons not to do testing. There may be some things that people would want to put in place first before they do testing. What I talk to families about is, there are lots of limitations of testing. There are some reasons not to do testing. And so part of what we do when we do the genetic counseling piece of that is to explore what some of those things are. You may be at a period in your life where, things are kind of chaotic. You've got a lot of things on your plate. Adding information about a gene and being at risk for something hereditary might be too much to deal with. There are some, psychological things that come up. Most women that I talk to that have genetic testing done say that 2-week period, even though it's just 2 weeks, can be a very stressful time for them. And so if they have a history of, talking to a psychologist in the past, or having this dumped on top of them could make it very difficult to deal with that. So we encourage them to get back in touch with someone that they can talk to and talk with them through that. Sometimes we'll have very young people who come in and do the testing. We don't, by the way, we don't test minors for most of these genes. These are adult onset conditions, would not change our recommendations for screening anyway until they get a little bit older. So in the state of Nebraska, legal adult is 19, so we typically recommend waiting until 19 to at least to do some of the testing. Not all 19-year-olds are mature enough to handle some of the information, so that might not be the best time to do that. If someone is, like this week, I think is finals week for a lot of people in college here in Nebraska, this would probably not be a good week to do testing. There are a lot of other things that they're dealing with, so I think timing is important for families. I have seen genetic testing bring families closer together. I've seen it split families apart. Sometimes when we do testing for families, some people will test positive, some people will test negative, and that does sometimes interfere with family relationships. So a discussion about that, kind of preparing families for that ahead of time, and how they might use that information and deal with that. So that's part of the, I guess, the genetic counseling piece of that, and all families are different, so not everyone, deals with this information in the same way. Some people may not even want this information, and that's their right not to know. and we would honor that in genetics. You know, I'm kind of a advocate for genetic testing, but I understand there are reasons why people might not want to have that information. As long as they're getting their screening and we're following them appropriately based on their family history, and I think that's okay. The other piece of that is, let's see, you had said something about who's doing the testing. So part of it is being prepared to do that and looking at the family history. And anybody can draw the blood and send it to the lab, yes, and that a lot of that gets done. I think the question is, are we doing the right testing? So I have seen lots of people in my clinic where in this day and age, they had 2 genes tested and that was it. And so they come to me and it's negative and they say, well, what do we do? And it's like, well, there's a lot more we can look at to evaluate that for families. But a lot of insurance companies right now will pay for testing. But sometimes in the policies, I know with Medicare, some of the policies we're seeing around here, they do genetic testing once per lifetime. So if we try to go back and do some additional testing, we can't get it done. Or we can, but it's out of pocket for them. So I think it's important to look at family history and make sure we're doing the right testing up front so that we're not missing anything. So, and I have to say, you know, I work in hereditary cancer full time, and sometimes it's a full-time job keeping up with all the changes that are happening in genetics. And so I can't even imagine trying to be a physician taking care of everything for someone and then doing genetic testing on the side. I would say within the last year, those panels that we talked about, there are changes that have been made within those panels just within the last 6 months, within the last 12 months. And I anticipate that those changes will continue to happen. So I would encourage families to make sure they're going to someone who's keeping up with some of that or has the time to keep up with some of that to make sure the appropriate testing is done. And like I said, you might be concerned about the breast cancer that your mom had, but we also need to look at dad's side of the family, and if we need to do testing there, incorporate that into it. And then I do see a lot of people in our clinic where someone has had the testing done, it's come back positive, and then whoever ordered the testing didn't know what to do with that information. And we're happy to talk with families about what is this result, what does it mean, what do we do with this information. But I think it is important to make sure that whoever's doing the testing has some of that knowledge as well to help guide families through that. And some people are good at that, yeah.
We've got a couple more before we wrap up.
This is a long one.
So
Oh, here.
It says, I am a survivor diagnosed at 45 years old. Genetic test January 2010. Negative BRCA1/2. That's my first cousin my age. Was just diagnosed with December breast cancer and checked 2 positive. I did the genetic test again as they did check about 8 years ago and sure enough positive. I have 6 siblings. First sister checked 2 positive. Just found out one of her daughters also checked 2 positive. All mutations are identical. What now?
So what now, I'm not sure what you're asking, like what now, like who else do we test in the family, or what now as far as what do we do with this information for screening? And again, CHEK2 is one of those genes where it might make a difference depending upon what mutation it is in the family. There's one common mutation that we see, it's a founder mutation that we see in families, and we tend to see a little bit higher risk of breast cancer in those families. Some different mutations or variants in that gene, a little bit less risk. In fact, when we talk about risk for CHEK2, there's kind of a range of risk, maybe somewhere between 20% and 54%. That sounds like a huge range, but some of that is when they look at families that have CHEK2 mutations, some of them are at the upper end of that range, some are at the lower end. And so we typically quote a risk that is based on the mutation, the gene, and then what we're seeing in the family. So with CHEK2, a lot of times we'll recommend starting our screening a little bit younger, and depending on the family history, it is one of those moderate risk genes, but in some families it tends to be a little bit on the higher end of that. And so looking at breast MRI is a way to screen for that. One of the questions that families ask about, well, what about risk reducing mastectomy? Is that appropriate for someone who has a CHEK2 mutation in the family? And again, I think it kind of depends on what the family history is telling us and what that mutation is. In some families, I think that is appropriate to consider that. In some, that risk might be a little bit lower and maybe not be an indication for that. Does that help answer I'm hoping that answered her question.
Hope so.
Okay.
We're gonna assume it did. So we've
Okay.
got one, another one. My sibling, is that the one? No, my sibling had renal cancer. I had triple negative breast cancer and thyroid cancer, and I tested negative for BRCA1 and 2. Should my daughter and sister be tested? I also have an aunt with a jaw cancer and great aunt with breast and ovarian cancer.
Okay. So this is one of those where if you just had BRCA1 and 2 testing done, and that would, I'm sure, was a very appropriate test at the time that was done. I think there's more that we can look at. And there are hereditary cancer genes that we know about that are part of kidney cancer. And so it might be important to look at a little bit broader panel for you and your family, and kind of analyze some of those genes. Some of those genes can also play a role in breast cancer. There's some genes that link the two. So I wouldn't test children in that case. I think the most appropriate person to test would probably be you, since you've had those cancers, but just going a little bit further with what testing we can offer and look at.
Well, great. That's the end of our hour with you.
Okay.
Thank you so much.